This is Dr. Bafana with another lecture on Middle East politics. In this lecture, which is going to be the 26th one in this series, we're going to talk about the Islamic Republic of Iran. And specifically, we're going to focus on the causes of the Islamic Revolution of 1979, and then we're going to talk about the aftermath of it and the political system there that exists today. And of course, this is an incredibly important topic. Iran is one of the largest and most powerful countries in the region. It has a great influence on its neighboring countries. And of course, it's had a conflict with the United States and Israel over the last couple of decades. So we're going to understand why that's the case as well. So we're going to do this in two parts. So I'm going to have the 26th and 27th lecture be about this particular case study. So first, let me just share my screen with all of you. All right. Okay, so we're going to continue our unit on political Islamism. Now, in our last lecture, we talked a lot about Sunni Islamist movements in the Muslim Brotherhood and why their influence spread throughout the Middle East from the 1970s to the 2000s. Well, in today's lecture, we're going to focus on Shia political Islamism. And in the process, we have to focus on the region's largest Shia country, Iran. So, in order to be able to learn about this topic, we have to understand what a revolution is and what that revolution was in 1979 in Iran specifically. We also have to understand what a theocracy is and the type of theocracy that was established in Iran, an Islamic republic. Now, on top of that as well, we're going to learn about the reasons for the Islamic Revolution, and we're going to tie this into more general political science literature about why revolutions happen. And you're going to notice that Iran has a lot of things in common with other countries that have experienced revolutions. However, one of the things that does make this 79 revolution unique is that in the aftermath, a theocracy was created. This is very different from, say, the liberal revolutions in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th century, or the communist revolutions in Russia and other parts of the world in the early to mid 20th century. You see, this revolution, it is going to lead to what's called a reactionary backlash. So it makes it a very unique revolution in world history. And we're also going to identify the key characteristics of the Islamic Republic of Iran's political system, domestically and internationally. So we can understand a lot about this country here. So first things first, let's just identify this place on a map. Now notice that Iran is in the far eastern part of the Middle East. It's located right next to this country, Iraq. Don't get Iraq and Iran confused, two very different countries. See, Iraq to the west is an Arab majority speaking country, whereas Iran, the majority here speak a language called Farsi. Iran is also a relatively large country. It's got about 86 million people. It actually has a larger population than the entire Arab Gulf combined. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that while the Arab Gulf is a desert, Iran does receive a lot of rain coming from the moisture from the Caspian Sea. You see on the center of the country here, this place is known as the Iranian Plateau. They get a lot of water there. There are rivers. There's historically been a lot of agriculture. It can sustain a large population. Now, surrounding this plateau are two very large mountain ranges, the Zagros and Elburz. They have, in many ways, protected Persian culture from the expansion of Arab culture coming from the West in previous centuries. So while Iran has become a Muslim majority country, it has preserved some aspects of its unique cultural identity all the way up until the present. Now, a couple of other things about Iran that are important. So, this term Persia. Now, Persia is what many Westerners used to refer to Iran as prior to the mid 20th century. So, for example, Greek civilization, they used to know Iran as Persia. So, while the Iranians called themselves Iranian, many outsiders referred to them as Persians. Now, why was this case? Well, because for one, their majority language is Farsi or Parsi, okay, and Parsi, Persian. So that's why this land has often been known by this name by many outsiders. Now, with that said, There are other languages that are spoken in Iran. Now, Farsi is spoken by the majority in the center of the country in the Iranian plateau, but in the mountains towards the northwest, Azeris, who speak a Turkish-based language, they are found nestled in the mountain ranges here. And just south of them are the Kurds, who also speak their own unique language, about 10% of the population. There are also a small number of Arabic speakers along the coast here, and of course, there are a lot of Arabic words within Farsi and these other languages because of the spread of the Islamic faith beginning in the 7th century. So there is a lot of Arabic influence on this culture. And then in the southeast here, we have the Baluchi. There are nomadic people that also speak their own language. Then finally, in the mountain ranges to the north, we have the Mazandarani and a bunch of these other small little languages as well. So Iran is very diverse. Now, with that said, it is also important to note that Farsi is spoken as a second language by most of these other groups because the Iranian political system requires it within the educational system. So Farsi is widely spoken as a lingua franca here. Now, a couple of other important things about Iran. If we want to understand its revolution that would take place, Iran has had a long history of monarchy. In fact, it was a monarchy that got overthrown in 1979. It's had 2,500 years of agrarian civilization and kings throughout the millennia. And these kings often ruled over vast, great empires. The first great empire, the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, extended all the way from Central Asia to North Africa and the borders with Greece here. In fact, they got into a number of wars with Greece. If you're familiar with Greek history, hell, even if you've seen the movie 300, you might have a little awareness of this, right? So the Greeks knew these Iranians as Persians because of the language they spoke. And in fact, they referred to their capital, the Greeks, as Persepolis, which means the city of the Persians. So Iran, it's got this glorious history of having these large empires. Many of these empires were very diverse with many different religious and linguistic groups. And so we could see here, just like ancient Sumeria and Egypt, there's a long history of agrarian civilization. Now, these monarchs, including the monarch that was overthrown in 1979, were known as Shahs, the Persian word for king. Cyrus the Great was the first Shah of Iran. He's known for his declaration of religious toleration. He allowed the Jews to return back to Jerusalem from captivity in Babylon, for example. The Babylonians had enslaved the Jews before the coming of this Persian Empire. And, since then, Iranian kings, ruled over the Iranian plateau, with one dynasty following another over the centuries. Now, a couple of other things that are important here. Along with having this history of Persian culture and Iranian culture, and by the way, before the 7th century, the majority religion was Zoroastrianism. It's a monotheistic faith. If you want to know more about that religion, watch a prior lecture of mine on the people of the book. Okay. So before the 7th century, Iran had this religion known as Zoroastrianism. But with the expansion of Islam in the 7th century from the Arabian Peninsula, eventually Iran or Persia would be conquered. And over the following centuries, Arabs would convert most of the Iranian population to the Islamic faith. Some were incentivized to convert because that meant a tax break. Others were inspired by Islamic preachers. There was also political benefits to be had by converting. So over the centuries, Iran becomes a majority Muslim nation. And by the way, for several centuries as well, the Iranian plateau was ruled by Arab dynasties. First by the Rashidun caliphs, that is the successors to the Prophet Muhammad. They're shown here on this map as being the Orthodox Caliphate. Then they were ruled by the Umayyads for a little less than a century, and then by the Abbasids, okay? So until 1250 AD. So there was a series of Arab rulers that ruled over Iran, but they managed to keep their own sense of Persian identity. In the process, they themselves influenced the golden age of Islam. So, for example, al-Khwarizmi, the famous mathematician that invented algebra and studied in Baghdad during the golden age, he was of Persian descent. So they would really become integrated into Islamic culture and they would contribute to it with their own scholars, with their own cultural traditions. Now, a couple of other things that are important to know about Iran here. Okay, so other than the fact that it's been ruled by kings, that it's majority Muslim, is that the type of Islam since the 16th century that has been practiced by the majority is known as Twelver Shi'ism. We talked about what this is in a previous lecture. So Shiism, okay, and much like Sunnis, they're Muslims, right? So a Shi is someone who believes in the five pillars. They believe in praying 5 times a day. They believe in one God. They believe that Muhammad is the last prophet of God. They believe in fasting during Ramadan, and of course, believe in giving to charity. So they believe in the five pillars. But what makes them different from Sunnis is that Shia believe that only the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, through his cousin Ali and his daughter Fatima, could become rulers of the Islamic community, whereas Sunni believed that any good Muslim could be Muhammad's successor. Well, Twelver Shia also have a very specific belief. They believe that Muhammad had 12 different successors, and that in a row, in a line, and that the last of them died. His name was Muhammad al-Mahdi, and that he'll return at the end of time as the savior of mankind. So that's the basis of Twelver Shia beliefs. And of course, Shia believe that all 12 of those imams were martyred by Sunnis. They were killed by Sunnis, and they engage in various rituals to remember that martyrdom that took place, visiting the pilgrimages of the sites of those fallen martyrs, engaging in self-flagellation. That's when you purposely cut yourself or hurt yourself as a way to kind of remember the pain of the fallen martyrs. They do that during a special holiday called Al-Muharram. So very popular holiday I'm sorry, it's known as the Ashura holiday. It takes place during the first Islamic month of Muharram. So the Twelver Shi'ism is now the majority faith in Iran. And this has to do with an empire known as the Safavid Empire. Now, the Safavids, they were these Turkish conquerors that conquered Iran in the 16th century. And they brought with them their own version of Islam. They imposed Twelver Shi'ism on the population during the 2+ centuries they ruled over Iran. Now, one of the things that's important to know about Shi'ism is that, much like Catholicism, they have a religious hierarchy. At the bottom of this hierarchy are religious students and graduates of religious seminaries. And at the top of the hierarchy are what we call ayatollahs, kind of like popes in Catholicism. Now, Ayatollah means sign of God, okay? And it's somebody who has great religious learning. And what are the jobs of this religious clergy, this hierarchy? Well, they interpret Islamic law. They served as judges during the days of the Safavid Empire, and even after that empire ended. They served as imams in mosques, leading the way towards prayer. They educated students on the Islamic faith. So they helped as well preach the faith throughout Iran and convert most of the population. Today, about 87% of Iranians are Shia. Now, there are religious minorities in Iran. It's a diverse country. About 11% are Sunni Muslims. And you also have the people of the book, monotheists. So there are Christians as well as Zoroastrians that still exist. Most of the Zoroastrian population has declined, has almost been eliminated at this point in history. So a little less than 1% continue to practice this faith. There used to be a Jewish population as well, but because of the emergence of the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Islamic Revolution in 1979, just about the whole Jewish population is gone. So this is the largest Shia country in the world. Another important element about Iran. Okay, so what else is important here? Well, another aspect of the Iranian Revolution that you're going to need to understand is that Iran has got a very complicated history with the West, one that involves a lot of Western invasions and a lot of bad blood. And this history started with a dynasty known as the Qajar dynasty. Now, what happened to the Safavids? Well, they ruled over Iran for 2 centuries. They had a They were one of the gunpowder empires of that age, like the Ottoman Empire. And but eventually they declined, and they declined due to the rise of modern Europe, the West, right? So because of the economic growth of Europe, because of their dominance of global trade routes by the 18th century, empires like the Ottoman and Safavid empires declined. They lost access to a lot of their wealth and power. And eventually, the Safavid empire collapsed in a civil war in the late 18th century. For 50 years, approximately, Iran was at war. And eventually, a new dynasty led by this tribe called the Qajars, they come into power, they form a new monarchy that lasted a little over a century, from 1789 to 1925. Now, immediately, though, this dynasty would suffer from imperial encroachment from Western powers. So at this time, Russia was expanding out across Siberia and Central Asia and the Caucasus region, and they were beginning to take territory from the Iranians. And on top of that, the British, of course, were creating their own global empire. So, for example, they conquered much of India from the late 1700s through the 1800s. They're going to eventually conquer the entire Indian subcontinent and eventually even expand into parts of Afghanistan. So basically, the Qajar dynasty is being squeezed from all sides. And on top of it, the British were also establishing protectorates in the Arab Gulf during this era. So the Qajars were faced with a choice: either modernize or die, right? So modernization, this is all about industrializing, establishing modern universities, promoting modern science, right? So the Qajar Shah Nasr al-Din, starting in the middle of the 19th century, began to make reforms to try to modernize Iran's military and its political system so that they could prevent European conquests. And so part of that meant military reforms. He began to borrow money from the Europeans to invest in a modern military. He modeled it off the Russian military. He created what's called the Persian Cossack Brigade, for example. He also began to invest in infrastructure and universities. So he began to as well invite in European advisors from France, Great Britain, Russia, to help run schools and universities, to help train a small middle class of bureaucrats and military officers that could run this new state. And they also as well began to invest in roads, bridges, ports, right, to try to increase trade and to be able to increase tax revenue and create economic developments. And on top of it as well, there were attempts to build factories. Now, at the end of the day, these reforms are going to end up having a lot of failures. Part of the reason for that is that the Qajar Shahs grew badly into debt with the Europeans. And as they grew more into debt, the government began to sell land to different businessmen, long-term concessions to British businessmen. And so what did this entail? So, for example, the British were interested in agriculture in Iran to grow cash crops like tobacco. And so wealthy Europeans began to take on large tracts of land. And of course, this was a big problem for many people within Iran because they saw European influence expanding economically and culturally. Now, on top of that, part of the reason for the failure of the reforms is that a lot of money was wasted on corruption. This was a monarchy, after all. There was no democratically elected legislature. There was no checks on the monarch's power. A lot of the money that was borrowed went into building these lavish palaces built in the Baroque style, found in places like France. And, here we've got Nasser al-Din Shah here to the left. You could see here in this European style regalia. So he's kind of becoming a bit westernized here in his tastes. And so his regime was associated with corruption. Now, lastly, a big problem here is that while the regime was beginning to create a middle class, it was beginning to educate some people, was starting to urbanize, much of the new middle class that's going to emerge is going to oppose the Shah for a number of reasons. They're going to create what are called social movements, right? Protest movements in order to oppose the monarchy. and to try to get changes to the system. So we begin to see this happen in the late 1800s, especially as the debt to the Europeans grow and as opposition to these concessions emerge. Now, some of these activists were liberals. They wanted democracy. They wanted the Shah to open up to reforms, to create a majlis, or what's called a legislature. They wanted the Shah to create a constitution to ensure basic civil liberties and political rights. Now, at the same time, Islamists also began to mobilize. We talked in an earlier lecture about Jamal ad-Din Afghani, for example, a very famous Islamist writer and activist born in Western Afghanistan, who was actually Shia, and he actually traveled in Iran during this time period, encouraging revolts. In fact, he also encouraged revolt elsewhere in the Islamic world against European influence. And so by the 1890s, we get mass protests against the European influence in the country, as well as against the Shah. And eventually, these protest movements, they culminate in a revolution in 1905. And what happened is this revolution overthrew the government, and they established a constitutional monarchy. So the absolute monarchy, where the king has all the power, the Shah has all the power, that gets overthrown. And for the first time in Iran's history, we have a legislature that's going to be democratically elected by the literate male population. So a legislature is created here called a majlis, and they're going to be able to vote and have elections. In fact, a year later, there's going to be voting for the first time. Liberal and Islamist parties are going to partake in this new government. And of course, one of the first things this new government wanted to do was to get rid of this European influence in the country and to end these concessions. And of course, as you're about to find out, the British and the Russians didn't exactly like this, right? By the way, here's Iran's first elected legislature. So, liberalism, okay, has a very long influence in Iran going back to the late 19th century. Okay, support for democracy. Now, as a consequence of this, what's going to happen is the British and Russians are going to decide to invade to protect their influence over Iran, to protect their economic and political interests. So 1908, they invade the country and they establish spheres of influence. Now, they couldn't decide on who exactly would take this country as a colony, so they decided to instead just prop up the Qajar monarchy, keep the monarch in to rule in their stead, right? So this is going to be indirect colonization. So they prop up the monarchy there, and they tell the monarch, look, you're going to continue to allow British and Russian influence. And the British and Russians also created their spheres of influence here in the North and South. Now, during this era as well, oil gets discovered. And eventually they're going to start to pull oil out of the ground, and Iran's going to become even more strategically important for these European powers. In fact, well over 60% of Iran's economy today is dependent on fossil fuels. And so they're going to remain there, these forces, until after World War I. 1925, they are going to pull out, but they basically tell the Qajar Shahs, you have to allow us to continue drilling for oil. You have to allow us to continue to have, control over farmland and so on and so forth. So you can't take our property. So, for example, the British, they created this joint stock company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, where they shared oil revenue with the Qajar monarchy. And so it was founded in 1909, this company. And so you can see where the oil is located on the map. Most of it is in the Persian Gulf here. Here's the port of Abydos, one of the most important ports for the Iranians here. And there's also some oil as well located in the northwest near, at the time, what was the border of the Russian Empire. So oil becomes incredibly important, and an infrastructure was built to send it to the coast and take it out. And that's all the imperialists cared about at this time. They weren't interested in investing in education or economic development. Okay, so the British and Russians leave. And when that happens, it leads to power vacuum, it leads to instability and chaos, and then there was a military coup. And this coup was led by a Western educated officer named Reza Shah Pahlavi. And he saw himself just like Ataturk in Turkey, just like Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt later, as being a kind of westernizing reformer, as being a secularist. So he creates a new government. What made him different, though, from Ataturk in Turkey is that he did not create a republic. Instead, he created a new monarchy and he made himself the king. So he creates the Pahlavi dynasty. And this is going to last, this dynasty, all the way up until the revolution of 1979. And in the process, he created Iran's modern state. So he wanted to create a state in the style of a Western secular model. So, for example, he begins to use the country's oil revenue to invest in things like an infrastructure. He starts building roads, bridges, modern ports. He starts to invest more in universal schooling. He starts to build state-run factories with the immense amount of oil wealth that starts to enter the country. And so, of course, he wants to model this off of Mustafa Kemal, otherwise known as Ataturk. Turkey had been making these reforms since 1923, when that state formed after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And so he was seeking to borrow that model. Now, in the process, just like Ataturk, he promoted state feminism. He promoted women's equality. And so part of this involved, for example, creating a secular criminal court system and treating men and women equally within that court system. It involved encouraging women to get an education, a secular education, and to start serving in the government, start serving in the economy. And he also, as well, created a secular set of law codes modeled off countries like France. And in the process, he treats religious minorities equally. So abolishing that system that forced religious minorities to pay a special jizya tax. And finally, he promotes modern nationalism, trying to unite the entire country around a single Iranian identity. Now, this involved promoting the Farsi language in schools. So you're going to see literacy increase across all of Iran during this era. A modern national identity and newspapers are really going to become prominent during this era. So, okay, at first, this regime was fine by the British and the Russians. As long as Reza Shah Pahlavi didn't kick out the British oil companies, didn't kick out the Russian interests, at that time it was the Soviet Union, they were fine with Pahlavi's rule. However, things changed during World War II. 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, Nazi Germany, and then eventually they're going to successfully invade all of France. And at that point, Reza Shah Pahlavi gets an idea. He thinks this is a great opportunity to kick out those Western oil companies and kick out Western interests. So he ends up supporting Nazi Germany in this war. He declares an alliance with them. He tries to kick out British economic interest. And so what happens? Russia and Great Britain, or I should say the Soviet Union and Great Britain, invade Iran in 1941. So we get the second invasion. We can see why the Iranians have some bad blood with Western countries. So what happens is they force Reza Shah out of power. In fact, he's forced into exile to South Africa, and they are going to replace him with his pro-Western son. At the time, he was much younger than the man in this photo, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. So his son Muhammad becomes the new king. At the time he was very young, politically very naive, and he was educated in the West. He really liked Parisian culture, French culture. He had a lot of French taste, spoke the French language well. So they replace him with this pro-Western monarch. And they are going to prop him up and keep him in power. Now, they are going to remain there, the British and the Russians, until World War II ends. But in 1945, they are going to leave the country again. They're going to leave a very weak king behind. And what's going to happen is Iran is going to transition into a constitutional monarchy again after 1945. This is during the second wave of democratization, as colonization is going to start to end throughout the globe. But almost from the beginning, the Shah is going to have a lot of conflict with the far left. You see, this is during a time when the Cold War was beginning. And a lot of leftist labor union activists, people who supported the Soviet Union, communists, as well as moderate leftists like social democrats, they're going to begin to emerge in Iran, promoting the redistribution of wealth and promoting the end of Western influence in Iran. So the Shah had a lot of conflict with these leftists. And in fact, in 1951, a coalition of leftists won control of the government in elections. They were led by the National Front, which was a social democratic party. They believed in democracy, but they believed in also high taxes on the wealthy to fund a welfare state. They wanted to eventually, some of them were promoting to abolish the monarchy. They wanted to kick Western influence out of the country and nationalize the country's oil industry. And Mohammad Mossadegh was their political leader. He becomes prime minister in that year. And so this social democratic party, once it wins control of the country, they decide to nationalize Iran's oil industry. And this was a problem for the Shah, who was very closely tied to the West. He was in favor of capitalism, he was pro-Western, and thus there emerged a conflict. And so in 1951, the Western oil companies, they are forced out of the country. And eventually what's going to happen is street violence is going to take place. There's going to be a lot of conflict and instability in Iran during this era. So they didn't really have a full democratic transition here. There's too much violence for that. And eventually the Shah was forced to flee the country in 1953 as a result of this. Now, when he fled, the British decided that they wanted to protect their interest in the oil industry in this country. By this time, oil was so important for the global economy. And, the British had a very myopic view or very narrow view, right? It's for them, they wanted access to these oil resources. So they placed sanctions on Iran. And on top of that, they blockaded the city of Abadan, that port city that I showed you on the map a second ago. This created what's called the Abadan crisis. Iran's economy fell into just disarray. There was lots of street violence and lots of political conflict during this era. Now, here's the thing, though. The British at the time were no longer as strong as they used to be. Their empire was declining. And so they decided that they were going to need help if they were going to regain control of Iran's politics. So they turned to the United States, to the CIA, and specifically to the American CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And so what the American government decided to do was, in coordination with the British and the Shah, was to support a military coup. It was known as Operation Ajax. It was led by Kermit Roosevelt, a member of the CIA, and they began to give support, financial resources to supporters of the Shah in Iran, and and they found supporters within the military for the Shah, and they helped them overthrow Mossadegh's government. So thus, the United States overthrew, with the British, a democratically elected government in Iran in 1953. Now, what was America's excuse? Well, America was in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, right? And during the Cold War, America had a very narrow view of the world, as did the Soviet Union. For America, their major goal with foreign policy was to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union and promote the expansion of capitalism at all costs. And this also meant as well often engaging in realpolitik, overthrowing governments, engaging in wars overseas in places like Vietnam, South Korea, engaging in coups in places like Chile in 1973. So this was part of a long trend of behavior by the United States. And the Soviet Union was doing a lot of this as well. We're going to talk later in a future lecture how the Soviet Union tried to invade Afghanistan, for example, in the late 1970s and 1980s. And so America, they overthrow Iran's government and they reinstall Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi as the monarch. So that's 3 cases of Western military intervention in this country in the span of about a half century. Okay, so if you ever ask the question, why do so many Iranians have a have a problem with the United States as well as many other Western countries? Now you know. And by the way, while most Americans don't know who Mohammad Mossadegh is, just about all Iranian school children do, right? So there are very deep memories about what happened here in Iran during this particular era. And so he is taught within Iranian schools, something very important to keep in mind. Now, here's the thing with Mohammad Reza Shah. During his first period in power, he was a relatively weak monarch and inexperienced. He's going to learn his lesson this time around. He's going to come back into power in 1953, and he's going to be a Western-backed dictator. And he is not going to tolerate any opposition this time around. He is going to create a police state. He's going to use the country's oil wealth to invest in the country's military, its police force. They're going to create a secret police called Savak, and they're going to hunt down the opposition. Some of the opposition is going to be imprisoned. Some are going to be executed. Many are going to be forced into exile. So the Social Democratic National Front was banned. The Communist Tudeh Party was also banned as well. So they're going to be cracked down upon. And on top of that, they are going to form a very strong alliance with the United States. In fact, this autocracy would not have been possible without American assistance. In 1955, the Iranian government signs the Baghdad Pact. It was an anti-communist pact between countries in the region that were opposed to the Soviet Union. This included Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. All these countries received aid from the West. In fact, you might have heard of the Truman Doctrine, for example, which gave aid to Greece and Turkey. So the pact wouldn't last long. Iraq is eventually going to drop out when they have a revolution in 1958. An Arab nationalist socialist government is eventually going to come into power there. But what was important about this is Iran starts to receive a lot of American foreign aid, including a lot of weapons, a lot of modern weaponry. Now, in return for this, the Shah is going to split the oil revenues with Western oil companies, including British and American companies. What is now ExxonMobil, for example, is going to operate within Iran. And that oil wealth, okay, was poured into the police and military, was poured into coercing the opposition. And, Savak, as a secret police, they would dress in plain clothing. They would, they would sit in and listen in cafes, theaters, bars, clubs, on the street in public squares. And if they heard or saw any political activity that they considered dangerous, they would arrest people, put them in prison, torture them to get information out of them. So really a ruthless police state was created here. But at the same time, despite all the oil wealth entering Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah created one of the weakest welfare states in the region. In fact, inequality skyrocketed during this era. Iran's population grew, but not much of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of the few. And so this is what the Savak secret police looked like. You got these plain dressed men in clothes arresting people on the streets. And so that's part of how this regime ruled. Now, of course, the Shah did need to find ways to try to also justify his monarchy and his power. And he decides to try to increase his legitimacy, particularly with the West, in 1963 when he announces what is called the White Revolution. Now, it wasn't a revolution in terms of, a mass of people that overthrow the government, like the French Revolution. Instead, it was a top-down set of reforms by the Shah to secularize and to modernize Persian culture or Iranian culture. So, for example, he establishes a universal education system, right? Making sure all primary children have access to schooling. And in the process, he strips the Shia ulama, the Shia religious clerics, of their control of any educational system. So the private religious schools are abolished in the process. And on top of that, he confiscates much of the land of the mosques, okay, the religious endowments, stripping a lot of the economic power away from the religious elites, from the ayatollahs and other religious scholars. And on top of this, he begins to invest in the urban infrastructure of the country. So he starts to invest in, a modern downtown for Tehran. He also, in the process, builds a lot of palaces for himself and, invests in a lot of luxury goods for himself. In fact, he had his meals flown in from Paris, this guy. On top of that, he is going to invest in state feminism, right? He's going to give women the right to vote, the right to get a divorce. He's going to make it even easier for women to get access to an education. So, and on top of it as well, the Shia clergy, they're going to lose control over the family courts. Now, we learned his father, he secularized the criminal courts. Well, now the family courts, which controlled inheritance, marriage, that sort of thing, they're going to be secularized as well. So, of course, these policies, though, they're going to be opposed by the rural elites and the religious clergy. So basically, the Shah is making enemies everywhere. The liberals hated him because he was an autocrat that didn't allow dissent. The communists and the social democrats hated him because, he promoted capitalism and there was severe wealth inequality, cracked down on labor unions. And finally, the conservative religious folks, the clergy, conservative people in the countryside, they hated this guy because of his promotion of secularism. So at the time, the head of the religious clergy, Ayatollah Khamenei, he responded to these reforms with horror, right? So he was seeing a society that was losing its way religiously. And so the religious clerics begin to mobilize against the regime and they begin to start protests. So in 1963, Savak cracks down on these people and Ayatollah Khomeini gets sent into exile. Now, they didn't want to murder him, right? They didn't want to kill him, the government, because they didn't want to create mass protest over it. So instead, they just kicked him out of the country. First, he goes to Iraq, later to France, but he would continue Khomeini to record messages via recorder and to sneak in cassette tapes to his supporters, so to keep the opposition alive. And so here's Ayatollah Khamenei. You could see him here with the traditional, the long beard here. You could see him here with his turban, right? So dressed in the traditional style for religious clerics. And he was an Islamist. And what does this mean? He wasn't just a Muslim, but he also believed in the mixing of religion and politics, right? So he wanted Sharia law to be the law of the land. On top of that, he begins, while in exile, to promote this idea that it should be the religious clerics that rule over Iran, not the Shah, that Iran needed to have religious values reestablished over the population. During his lifetime, he witnessed a secular middle class emerge, the emergence of bars and alcohol, and there were even porno theaters under the Mohammad Reza Shah that were emerging in the capital, Tehran. So things were becoming very secular in many quarters. And so he was part of a movement that tried to push back against this. So the Shah, despite having all this Western support, was deeply hated by most of the population. And eventually, what is going to happen by 1978 to 1979 is the Iranian Revolution. Now, what exactly is a revolution? Well, it's when a group of citizens outside the control of the state overthrow the government and replace it with a new regime, a new set of rules. Okay, it's not a coup because it's not the military doing it. And number two, it's not merely just a civil war or changeover in government. Revolutions involve radical change, right? Changes to the nature of the existing government. So the French Revolution overthrew a monarchy in 1789, okay, and by 1792 replaced that with a republic. The Russian Revolution in 1917 replaced a monarchy with a communist single-party dictatorship. Well, this revolution in 1979, as you're going to find out, is going to replace the government with an Islamic republic, a theocracy. Now, what are the reasons why this revolution happened when it did? Well, of course, there was mass opposition to the Shah, right? We've established that. But we have to explain the timing of, 1978 to 1979. Why did a lot of opposition grow to the Shah in this specific time period? And why were they able to protest in the way they did? Well, part of it has to do with something called relative deprivation. Relative deprivation is when either things get worse for people or people perceive them to be getting worse. And some scholars argue that this took place in Iran because of the drop in oil prices in 1978. Now, we learned in a prior lecture that oil prices had skyrocketed in 1973. During the 1973 war, the war between the Arab states of Egypt and Syria versus Israel, the Arab Gulf states decided to engage in oil boycotts, right? They stopped sending oil to Western countries in response to their support of Israel. Well, what happened in the aftermath is oil prices skyrocketed, right? And so there was a lot of fear and speculation in oil markets. Oil prices rose, and as a consequence of that, the economy in Iran grew, as did the revenue to the state. And this held for about 5 years. But in 1978, the prices finally came back down. When that happened, Iran entered into a recession. This is a big problem when your economy is based on so heavily on a single resource, right? Rentier states often have this problem. The price of oil comes down, your regime is going to face a lot of challenges. And so Iran faced a recession during this time period. And so, thus, even many of the regime's supporters within the military, the police, the bureaucracy, amongst some of the upper middle class that like the secular reforms, many of them begin to get upset with the Shah and the nature of the economy. So that's part of it, right? But revolutions can't just take place on anger alone. Activists need the resources and the opportunities to protest, right? Now, when did this opportunity come? Well, it came with the election of a new American president named Jimmy Carter. He was elected in 1976 and eventually took power in the beginning of the next year in 1977. And Jimmy Carter was, in comparison with past presidents during the Cold War, much more of an idealist. He decided to pressure a lot of dictatorships in the world to respect human rights norms. He was a very vocal supporter of democratization. Carter himself did not have a successful presidency. In fact, a lot went wrong socioeconomically and politically. He was known as a bit of an idealist. He wasn't very good at realpolitik. And on top of that, due to the Iranian Revolution, the price of oil is going to later skyrocket again, really downing his administration. But because he was an idealist, he pressured the Shah to allow more freedom. And because the American government was giving so much revenue to Iran, the Shah had to comply. And so the Shah starts to allow the opposition greater space to protest. But here's the thing, both the Shah and even Carter, the CIA, hell, even the revolutionaries themselves underestimated the amount of opposition there would be to the monarchy. You see, under a very autocratic regime, you don't know exactly how many people support or oppose the regime. In fact, the more totalitarian that regime is, the less you're going to know about popular attitudes, right? If people can't express themselves, you're not going to know who opposes the regime. Even amongst the opponents of the regime, they didn't know exactly who supported the government. So when they started to allow protests, suddenly more people came to the streets than the Shah thought they would, right? So you realize that there were a lot more opposition. And so the protests swelled very quickly. Panicking, okay, the Shah started to crack down. Now, here's the thing. These protests, they were not just led by Islamists, by religious clerics and conservatives. They were also led by the far left, by communists, social democrats, and liberals in support of liberal capitalists in support of democracy. So you had just a very diverse group of people from different walks of life protesting against this regime in large numbers. And the Shah, sometimes he would try to use violence to crack down, but then the American government would put pressure. He would back off. There would be protests again. And anytime there was a crackdown, oftentimes a bunch of people died and there would be funerals. And those funerals become the basis of further protests. And so, thus, the revolution swelled. And by 1979, the Shah was forced to flee Iran. And in the process, Ayatollah Khomeini, he comes home from exile as a hero here. And so thus, we're going to see the beginnings of the Islamic Republic. And so, the causes of the revolution, so much of this, just had to do with the corruption and inequality under the monarchy. It's way too much support coming from the West, overuse of political oppression. And these problems with socioeconomic inequality grew as urbanization took place, and the Shah ignored the growing problems in the outskirts of Tehran, the growing poverty in Tehran, the growing gaps in wealth. So on the left, we could see a shanty town on the outskirts of Tehran versus the Shah's downtown Tehran built in the style of Paris, right? So the monarch lived in luxury while his people suffered. Well, that does it for part one. For part two, we're going to discuss what happened in the aftermath of the revolution and the nature of the political regime that was established. So until then, I will see all of you next time.